In the parasha this week, we're going to see the Malachim come tell Avram and Sarah that they're going to have a child. And in doing so, they ask Avram Avinu where Sarah is. And Rashi notes that the pasuk uses dots on top of the word Elav, that they spoke to him, and says, from here we learn that actually they wanted to know from Sarah also about Avram Avinu, which gives us a take-home lesson. The Rebbe will ask 4 questions about that. And then he's going to quote in Rashi from Bava Metzia that there were actually 3 reasons that they wanted to know where Sarah was, and that will raise 7 questions as well. And of course, the underlying question that we have to ask is, what gets Rashi to comment in the first place? So what's bothering Rashi is each malach has a unique mission to fulfill. Why are all the malachim asking after Sarah if actually only one malach has to address her? So we're going to learn all kinds of interesting insights about the principle of the dots versus the letters, how you darshan. We're going to learn about the link between the 3 different explanations in Bava Metzia, and a take-home lesson for us, especially if we feel sometimes that we're floundering and don't have enough time for our Yiddishkeit. From Pasuk, Vayeira Elav, Ayei Sarah Eshtecha Gomer, on that pasuk where they said to Avram Avinu, the Malachim said to Avram Avinu, where is Sarah your wife? Is Rashi Matik Deveret of Vayeira Elav. Rashi quotes 2 words. Vayomer Elav, they said to him. Or as Mefarish explains as follows: Nakud Aleph Yud Vav Shebe Elav. That you have to note that on top of the word Elav there are dots, and the dots are specifically on the 3 letters Aleph Yud Vav. V'tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, and we have a principle taught by Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar that call Makim Shaksav Rabal Nekuda Atader Shaksav v'cholei. Any situation where there are more letters than nakudos, which is the majority of cases, you read into the letters and therefore you understand the word at face value. But vekan hanakuda rabal aksav ataderish hanakuda, whereas over here they are extra nakudos, and so that draws your eye and tells you should actually now interpret the nakudos. Sha'af l'sora sholo ayoy Avram. So says Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, this teaches us that not only did they ask Avram Avinu where Sarah was, but they actually asked Sarah about Avram as well, which gives us a great lesson about how you behave when you're at somebody else's house. That Lomadnu, from here we learn this teaches us that when a person is at others, you ask the host about the well-being of his wife, you ask the wife about the well-being of the husband. That's the first thing that Rashi teaches. Then there's a second segment of Rashi where he quotes Bava Metzia that there were 3 reasons why they wanted to know where Sarah was. We'll come to that shortly. In the meantime, we have to ask 4 questions. Is nicht verstanden? Aleph, Rashi's pirish is doch lechera bloise from word Elav, nokod alai Aleph Yud Vav shebe Elav. Surely all Rashi is explaining to us is the additional dots on top of the 3 letters of the word Elav. So surely then the word Elav should have been the headline of the Rashi. Why does Rashi include in his heading also the word Vayomer, which ostensibly he doesn't explain? Question 2. Base. Usually Rashi only quotes the name of who the source is if that's going to help us understand things better. So Rashi bringt dem Namen von Bala Maimer nur wenn das geht zu in Avon Seinen. The only time Rashi quotes who the source is if it helps to understand the concept better. So we have to ask ourselves, was war die Sefers Avon kommt dazu durch sagen aus dem Klal kol makim shaksav khulay hat gesagt Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. How do we better understand this principle about the dots versus the letters, now knowing that the author is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? Question number 3. If practically the Torah wants to draw our attention to an understanding that we wouldn't have immediately noticed, is it necessary to put 3 dots? Gimel, der Klal kol makim chuladav haben bir. This whole principle that you need extra dots to tell you to dash on the dots needs to be explained. Because why do you have to go that method? Add a whole lot of dots to draw our attention to the fact that there are letters with dots that outweigh the letters without dots, and therefore you have to pay attention to those letters. There's an easier way to do it. Seeing as logically, if I've got 4 letters, and if one of those letters has a nakuda and the majority don't, then I would darshan the majority of the letters without the dots. It's doch genug zum Lacket sein dem Mut, die nicht gedarschen to Oisius, und fällt dann gedarschen demselben Reif Oisius, Aksa will to Minu Kodesh. So logic says, you're looking for a method to draw my attention to certain letters. Well, if the principle says letters without dots, if they're in the majority, you darshan them, so just add 1 or 2 dots. In other words, the minority add dots, and that will draw our attention to the majority undotted letters. Or to be specific, in our case, we've got 4 letters to choose from. So, if the Torah wants to draw our eye to those 3 letters, Aleph Yud Vav, So you could have put one dot onto the lamed. Now there is one letter with a dot, three without. The rule is follow the majority. The same principle would now tell me I have to look at what Aleph Yud Vav represent, because they're the majority of letters without dots. Why is the solution dafka to put extra dots? You could achieve the same result with a single dot. And then Dalit, once we're looking at dots, let's make a comparison to a neighboring story where there's also a dot on a word, actually in this week's parasha. Noisef if the Shverkaten in the Pirish Rashi al Asar, besides the difficulties we've raised now and how Rashi explains things here in this pasuk, is doich faran astirim mitzadavaita dikim Pirish Rashi. Actually, read on a little bit further in the same parasha, and it would appear that Rashi actually contradicts himself. Because the story of Lot's daughters who seduced him says after the first daughter he didn't know when she lay with him, he didn't know when she got up in the morning. Zokt Rashi uvekuma. So Rashi says on that word uvekuma, nakud loima shebekuma yoda. There is a dot on top of the hay. Says Rashi, from that single dot we learn that actually when she got up in the morning he was aware of what had happened. Zet men doch derfun as nikud kumt eker sein dem Wort. Now, not only is it a single dot, but much more importantly, the pshat is he didn't know. The dot completely undermines the pshat and says he really did know. How does that fit with what Rashi is saying over here? There Rashi says the dot makes you completely redefine the word. Here Rashi says the dots make you explain what the dots within the word represent, but you don't redefine and reject the pshat. So that doesn't seem to add up. Okay, those are our questions on the first part of Rashi. Now let's go to the second part of Rashi. Dennoch is Rashi mamshich in selben dibur hamaschil. So Rashi doesn't even start a fresh headline. So that tells you whatever he's going to say next is linked to what we've just learned. So he continues. The Bab Metzia says, the Malachim knew where Sarah was. I mean, there are Malachim. That's not a surprise. So why did they ask? So what they asked is, they dafka asked, where's Sarah? To highlight the fact that Sarah was modest and that she wasn't in the room with them, so that Avraham Avinu would find her more attractive. That's the second explanation, because the first explanation is that it's actually telling us they wanted to know how she is, and they wanted Sarah to tell them about how Avram is doing. Second explanation now, based on Bab Mitzvah, is they knew where she was, but they wanted to highlight the fact that she was so modest that Avram Avinu would appreciate her more. And then a third explanation of Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina, they wanted to be able to send her kosher bracha. Obviously they had eaten, now they wanted to say a bracha at the end. Whether they benched or not in the classical sense, who knows, but there was a cup of wine that they'd made a bracha over and they wanted to send some to her. That's going to raise a string of questions, 7 questions in total. Number 1, how does this flow? You're talking about Aleph Yud Vav out of a love. These explanations that they knew where she was and they just wanted Avraham Avinu to appreciate her, or they wanted to send her the kosher bracha, is Aleph Yud Vav Avram. That is not an explanation of the words that Rashi is quoted as the headline, which is Vayoimru Elav. They addressed Avraham Avinu. This is actually explanation of the next words. Where's Sarah? Surely this deserves a whole separate Rashi under a different heading, because he's addressing a different issue. And not only that, but the Kash is noch starker. It's an even more serious question when you think about it. The fact that Rashi is now quoting the Gemara of Baba Metzia to say how modest she is, surely that contradicts what we've just read in Rashi. Is in they, according to Rashi in the first part, they addressed Sarah directly and asked her about Avraham Avinu. Surely that is not so modest, these strange men speaking to Sarah. How does Rashi accommodate both of these explanations in one continuum? They're contradictory. Either they spoke to her and she was out there in the public, or she was modest. Question 2, simple question. Why do we have to know the source? Why do we have to know that the origin is Bava Metzia? Rashi does not typically quote sources unless it's relevant. Which leads us to the next similar question, and like we asked earlier, Gimel Favos Demand Rashi and Bala Maimer from Gedele Shag Cholom Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina. And why do we have to know that within Bava Metzia, whose voice was it that said you sent her kosher bracha? Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina. How does that help to answer? And by the way, if we're talking about the kosher bracha, it is a bit strange that the malachim should send a kosher bracha. That's surely not so tznius. Dalet. Why did the malachim send their wine to Sarah as part of the kosher bracha? Surely that is completely inappropriate behavior. Strange men sending wine to a married woman. And besides, practically, Avram Atochir can geben von sein kosher bracha. Why couldn't Avram Avinu just share his own kosher bracha with Sarah and avoid this uncomfortable situation in the first place? And then we have to ask, look, now you've told me that there are 3 explanations, possibly, to what was going on over here, right? Hey, Rashi sagt dort 3 Time, was im Lachem haben gefragt, gomer. Rashi has now provided 3 possible reasons why they were asking about Sarah. First explanation is because it's appropriate to ask a host how his wife is. The second explanation, because to highlight and emphasize how tznius Sarah was. To send her the kosher bracha. So you need 3 explanations for this. Why do we need 3 different explanations? Right? Surely one explanation should do the trick. Vav Nochmer, take that a step further. Rashi's already told us at the beginning of the parasha, that one of the reasons the Malachim are there in the first place is to tell Sarah she's going to have a baby. Surely that's the reason then to ask where she is. Why is Rashi even asking the question, why did they want to know where Sarah was? Because that was their shlichus, to tell her she's going to have a baby. In fact, the very next thing is that they say, Sarah is going to have a baby, and the Torah tells us Sarah heard it. Why does Rashi have to look for any reason to explain why they were looking for Sarah? It's obvious why they were looking for Sarah. That's what they were there for. And the last point is, why does Rashi put a whole lot of explanations together without any separation between them? Zayin, die 3 Time, was Rashi brings, zayin, 3 besondere Time, was nicht kein Scheiches zum Zweiten. All 3 of the explanations that Rashi has given are completely independent. There is nothing that links asking the host to the fact that she's tznius to the fact that they're sending kosher bracha. Why then does Rashi put them all in one continuum? Surely Rashi should have used some kind of separator, as he often does. He has another explanation. So explanation number 1 is, you ask the host how his wife is doing. An alternative explanation, to show Avram Avinu how modest she was. An alternative explanation, because they wanted to say kosher bracha. Why does it just, Rashi puts them all together as if all of them are linked? And see, die Kasha is noch starker, especially when you consider the source. Im Masechta Bava Metzia steht Leut unsere Girse, Kedei lechaber chulei, Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina Omar Kedei leshager chulei. The Gemara Bava Metzia says that the first explanation was to highlight how beautiful Sarah is, because she's so modest. Number 2, Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina says, now the order of those words is really important, because those words indicate was the Loshe Rabbi Yosef Chanina Omar, the name from Balamaymer, far dem Wort Omar. In Gemara language, when you have the name before the word Omar, that indicates that Rabbi Yosef Chanina disagrees with the preceding explanation. On Rashi is Meshane und schreibt Rabbi Yosef Chanina. Rashi reverses that, and he puts the word Omar before Rabbi Yosef Chanina's name. Which indicates that he doesn't argue. In fact, he picks up on the conversation. So not only is it strange to us that Rashi hasn't separated 3 independent explanations into 3 separate segments, but he even seems to contradict his source, the Gemara, that says Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina disagreed with the principle of lechabba baila, and Rashi says it's all the same thing. So in order to answer this, we have to get to the key, what's bothering Rashi. The bir b'chol hanal. Mitzayim Pirshei Vayeira Lov Bavont Rashi. What Rashi wants to first tackle is, wie bald as in Pashas kommt this Scheide a Yesori Estecha in Zusammenhang zu Kedele Wasser Sorkenal. Seeing as we've already identified that the obvious reason to ask where Sarah is because there was a shlichus given to these malachim to tell Sarah she's going to have a child, that's actually the problem. That raises a question. The shlichus zum Wasser sein Soren is given bestimmt nor far ein malach. As we know, Rashi already points out at the beginning of the parasha that a malach can only do a single mission. So one malach was charged with telling Sarah she's going to have a baby. Rashi is medaik frier echod levaser Sarah. Rashi already pointed this out. He says one malach is there to tell Sarah she's going to have a baby. Was der Fark die Pirshashe sham steht don weiter. Vayemer shev ashruv goyim v'nei ben lesari shtecha vayemer beloshen yochid. That's what Rashi says when the message comes. I will come back in a year and you'll have a child. It's one malach speaking. That's the core issue here. As alle drei malachim gefragt Yisora. That's what bothers Rashi. If a single malach is required to tell Sarah she's going to have a baby, why do all three of the malachim vayomer in the plural all ask after Sarah? So now we get it. Der mitvet euch verantwortet, was Rashi is matig echt dem Wort vayomer. Weil Rashi kommt am Masbes einfach, was steht vayomer l'shein rabim. Now we've solved our first question. Why is vayomer included in the headline? Because not only is Rashi looking to address the question of the nukudos on Aleph Yud Vav of the word Elav, but he also wants to know the key question: why is it vayomer? Why are the malachim in plural looking for Sarah if only one of them has to deal with her? Und if them and for Rashi. To address that question, Rashi says this. Why do all three malachim ask after Sarah? Because it's an appropriate behavior that you ask your host how the family is, starting with his wife. As we bald alle malachim haben gefragt, Sarah Ishtecha, is das nicht kedei levaser Sarah. Rashi deducts that the fact that all of the malachim wanted to know where is Sarah is clearly not linked to the shlichus to tell her about the baby. But because that's the appropriate thing to do, to ask, how is your wife? And seeing now, as Rashi's derived from that word vayomru, a lesson that you have to ask your host about his family. Was das meint mitzad demselben time seile ish halo isha und seile isha al ha ish. Now, logic says that if there's this derech eretz that you're supposed to follow, which is find out how the family is, it's logical that it equally applies to ask the man about the woman and the woman about the man. So therefore, it's logical that if you're supposed to inquire about the well-being of the family, it's logical that it applies both ways, which means we already know that they're supposed to ask Sarah about Avram. So, now Rashi has another question. If it's clear that the malachim were meant to ask Sarah how Avram Avinu is doing, now we have a question, why didn't the Torah tell me as such? Sagt Rashi, as der Farm muss man sagen, as da ist der Nikodef Aleph Yud Vav Shebe'elav Shaykh zu Pshutei Shel Mikra. Therefore, Rashi says, this has to be a scenario now where the additional dots on the letters Aleph Yud Vav must relate to the Pshat, because I need something in the Pshat that tells me, yes, actually they asked Sarah as well how Avram Avinu is. Even though typically Rashi does not explain why there are dots on letters, because ordinarily it's not something which is intrinsic to understanding the pshat. But here it is. Why is it? Because we've just seen Vayoimru that they all asked, where is Sarah? Because they all have the responsibility to find out how the family is, and that's an equal responsibility that they should have asked Sarah about Avram Avinu, which means we have to find a way that the Torah tells me that happened. That's why I have to explain the Nekudas, even though I normally don't. Es bleibt noch aber nicht verständig. That's not the end of the story. It still leaves some questions for us. Usually, if you want to know how somebody is, the question is how they are, not where they are. So if, in fact, the malachim were required to ask, how is Sarah? Great. But why do they say, ayeh? Und fragen wir Schlemmisch Sarah ist doch kein Afgemein nicht, wo sie gefindt sich. It makes no difference where Sarah is to be able to ask how she is. Was haben die Malachim gefragt, Sarah? So now we have a question still part of the same conversation. That's why we're not starting a new Dibur HaMaskil and a new section, because it's still part of the same conversation. Why, in fact, did they ask where she is? Therefore, Rashi has to quote, he's got to give two additional explanations that would satisfy why not only did they want to know how Sarah is doing, but also where she's located. Either to highlight her tznius or to send a kosher bracha. As das, was die Melachim haben die Scheile beschlemmen gesagt in dem Lashon Sarah, is es gedel chabo und gedel shagel chule. So why did they ask the question dafka in a language which is associated with where she is? For exactly that reason, because they needed to be able to highlight her location either to Avraham Avinu or to themselves. Avraham Avinu for tznius, themselves for the kosher bracha. Now, der Midrash Rashi bringt von Bam Metziach l'idea shetznuah hoysa feinfat enoch hashayla. The minute Rashi quotes that opinion in Bava Metzia that says that it's kedei lechabava to make Avraham Avinu cherish Sarah because she's so modest, that automatically addresses a different question as well. Anytime that you have a word or a letter that has a dot on it, which is one of the big things we're trying to struggle with, right? Why do you look at the dots and not at the letter? Weist, as der Wort oder der Ois ist anders von anderen Wörter. The minute there's a dot on top of a word or on top of a letter, straight away the first thing you have to know is there's something unique about this word or about this letter, and it's not like any other words or letters that we've read. Now the big question is, how is it different? It definitely is different. How is it different? Now there are various possibilities. Sagen, als der Nicke kommt, es in ganzen Meichek sein, kämen nicht ad der Pshat. It would be too far a stretch for Pshat to say that the minute there are dots on a word, the word is no longer valuable. It's as if it's been cancelled. That wouldn't make any sense. Because if I'm at the Pshat level, then it doesn't make any sense to me. You're going to write a word and then cancel it. Just don't write the word. So the fact that the Torah wrote a word means I should take the word at face value, and then the Nekudos must add depth to it. So muss man sagen, as the Nikud macht noch schwacher de Minukot, the logic would be to say, okay, so I've got a word. Under normal circumstances, the word would have a very clear meaning. The dots now weaken that clarity. The word is not as strong as it normally would be, and he has an example directly from Rashi as well. We know in the great reunion of Yaakov and Esav comes over and he kisses Yaakov, and there's dots, right? There's a dot on Vayishakei. Says Rashi. Rashi says, why does it have a dot? To tell us that even though Esav kissed Yaakov, it wasn't sincere. So there you got it. A weakening of the word. Normally, neshika means to kiss. Normally, kissing means that there's a tremendous emotional investment. The Nakuda weakens and says, actually not. And even the second opinion that Rashi quotes over there, which is the exact opposite, that Esav actually was wholehearted in the way that he embraced Yaakov, that would weaken the perspective of how we normally know Esav, somebody who is prescribed by halacha that he hates Yaakov absolutely. So that's one possibility. You could weaken the word from its normal meaning. Oder nochmer, you could be even more extreme than that. As a niked is oiker mimekoima oder kolpanim michibur ve'nekra ha'even. Sometimes the nikud could totally uproot the word from context. Like, for example, the Gemara in Zvachim, which says if a kohen is doing avodah in the Beis Hamikdash and there's a stone that has been lifted out of where it belongs on the floor, and there's a whole question about whether it's still considered connected to the ground and he could do his avodah or not. So it's connected but disconnected. So we could do that to dem vort. The word could become disconnected from its context. Now that example is in our parsha. Rashi says that Lot didn't know. The pasuk says that Lot didn't know when his daughter lay with him or when she got up. Says Rashi, as Rashi says, no, we're going to pull the Vekuma out of the context. The context is that Lot was completely oblivious. We're actually going to pull it out of the context because there's a dot on the hey of Uvekuma, and that tells us that actually he was more aware than the context makes out. Come on, as him nit mechazek, nit moichek, but we're not cancelling the word. We're not saying that there was absolute knowledge, because as we'll see in a second, maybe Lot had knowledge, but the daughters didn't have knowledge. So it still has value. So let's read it. So the next thing that Torah tells us after Lot's first daughter slept with him, it says, we see that the girls the next day plan that they're going to drug their father again, intoxicate their father again, and the second daughter will sleep with him. Now, why did they have to do that? It's doch nicht moving. Seeing as Lot was conscious of the fact that he had slept with his daughter when she got up in the morning, it's not going to help to drug him tonight, because he knows his guard will be up. Either he's going to be complicit or he's going to be resistant. Now the bir in them is as das was vekuma yoda is gesagt for no leuten. So therefore you must know that when it says that uvekuma, that he was aware of the fact that his daughter got up, he was aware of that fact. But they were unaware of the fact that he was conscious of what had happened. That's why they thought they could repeat the same strategy and it would work. So that tells you that their word bekum is nerkafun v'lo yoda loit. So what does it tell you? The word uvekuma has been weakened. Why? Because it's removed from the person it's describing, Lot, because he, Taka, did know. But it's not completely cancelled from the whole conversation because the girls didn't know. So what do we see from here? That generally speaking, we've seen examples that a nakuda does not cancel a word even when it weakens it. So now let's take that into our context. Now we're talking about our context where you have the word a love, and now you've got nakudos on three of the letters. The fact that 3 out of the 4 letters have dots on top of them, Vaistes, illustrates, as the Shaila to Sarah, Ayoy Avram, is given nit b'teikef kol kach, v'di Shaila ilov to Avram. That tells you that the principle of a nakuda is that it weakens the meaning of the word. If the nakudas are specifically on the letters that tell us about the question directed to Sarah, how is Avram? That tells you that that part of the question was somehow less than the question to Avram, how is Sarah? So we had a question earlier, why do we need the dots on top of the letters that you're going to darshan? Just put a dot on the lamed and we'll automatically then darshan the others. It's because the dots are not just there to tell us where to focus your attention, but also how to interpret. The dots tell you that these letters have to be read as a weaker version of the meaning of the word. So the question to Avram Avinu, where is Sarah, is somehow a stronger question, or how is Sarah is a stronger question than the question to Sarah, how is Avram Avinu? And we'll see why. That explains why you need the dots on 3 of the letters. And why, in fact, yes, of course, if there was just a dot on the lamed, then just using the simple principle of which is the majority, that's what I'd darshan, I'd come to the same conclusion of which letters to darshan. Right, based on the principle we learned. The Torah doesn't just want me to know which letters I have to analyze, but also to know how to analyze them. Aleph, Yud, Vav is weaker than a love. The question to Sarah about Avram is not as strong as the question to Avram about Sarah. Why? In the Shaila Ayoy Avram, why is the question to Sarah Imenu about Avram Avinu less powerful than the question to Avram? Is es verstandig von dem, was Rashi bringt von Baba Metzia Leidia Shetznua Hoysa. That's why Rashi went straight from that directly into the conversation from Baba Metzia, which tells us because Sarah was modest. V'bal Sarah is given atznua. Is the svara mechayev. It's now logical that if Sarah is such a modest individual, then logically, then it has to be that when the Malachim spoke to her to inquire after Avram Avinu's well-being, it had to have been done in a toned down, modest fashion, a weakened fashion. Leidem is moving as also Sasha bring from Baba Metzia Leidia Snua Hoisa. So now we originally thought, wow, there's a contradiction over here. You're telling me she's so modest, but then you're telling me that they're asking her about Avram. It's actually not a contradiction. The fact that we're quoting Baba Metzia that she was so modest is to tell us it's not only considered in Pirshaf L'Sora Shala Ayoy Avram. Not only is it no longer a contradiction to the notion that they asked Sarah about Avram Avinu, Nadra befakert. Dafka durch dem wird mevor was die Eises Aleph Yud Vav sein in Menukot. Now that we understand that Tznius is such a big theme in this conversation, that helps us to understand why the dots are on the letters Aleph Yud Vav, because that indicates that Tznius, the dampening of the asking Sarah about Avram Avinu. Now, why do we have to know it's from Baba Metzia? So the time was beim Pirish Yodim Hoychul Leidesh Tznuah Hoisa. Is Rashi Maktim Baba Metzia Oimrim? The fact that Rashi first says Baba Metzia, they tell us that she was Tznius, is weil die Aschole de Klal von Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar steht euch in Bereshis Rabbah. Why? Because the principle that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar taught about asking the host and the hostess about each other is already quoted in the Medrash. So Rashi Azeh bringt dem Hefshach von Baba Metzia Dafke. Und das kommt beim Schach und again says it. Why does Rashi say that it's from Baba Metzia? Number one, because he has to show us that the flow works, and also that each side of the explanation bolsters the other side. The Riber is the by Rashi Madgish Baba Metzia Oimrim. So first of all, Rashi emphasizes not that an individual or that it's written in Baba Metzia. He says in Baba Metzia they say in the plural. Why? As der Ihnen was steht in Baba Metzia is Oimrim Stam. The principle that is taught in Baba Metzia that Sarah was so modest is Oimrim without a specific name associated with it, which means das stimmt alibe de kule alma, which means that all opinions agree that Sarah had this incredible level of tznius. And why is that relevant? Because it means because it's telling us, Rashi wants us to know that even Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who was the one who said that the Malachim were going to ask Sarah about Avram, he is also of the opinion that Tznuah Hoyasa, which is exactly where Rashi wants to be. He wants to be in a place where you realize that the asking of Sarah, how she was, is tznius, which helps us appreciate why the dots are on the Aleph Yud Vav. Not only that, but even according to Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, who said that they wanted to send her the kosher bracha, which sounded even less tznius, he also holds tznuah haisa. As we'll still see why it's not a contradiction that they sent her wine and yet it was tznius. So at this point, we now understand the flow. We understand that we need to tell the story about her being tznius in order to help us understand the Aleph Yud Vav and why the dots are specifically on those letters, and to clarify that even when they asked Sarah about her husband, it was done in the most tznius way. So why do we have to know the kosher bracha story? The truth is that even explaining that Sarah was so modest is still not a full picture of the story. Because obviously Avram Avinu knew that his wife was tznius. And the Malachim, being Malachim, must have been conscious of the fact that Avram Avinu knew how tznius his wife was. So to say lechabav al baila, to make Avram cherish Sarah, is a bit of a stretch. It's more like to remind Avram Avinu how much he already cherishes Sarah. That'd be more accurate. So because it's not, so to speak, a compelling enough reason for the Malachim to have asked about Sarah, the Rebbe is Rashi Moisef. That's how Rashi adds another explanation. That in addition, obviously, to the fact that they wanted to show Avram Avinu that they're so impressed at Sarah's modesty, they also practically needed to send her kosher bracha. Then you'll ask, so why do I have to get into a conversation about tznius? Just tell me simply that they wanted to send a kosher bracha, because that answer in itself is insufficient. So you've just heard the Gemara tell us that they actually knew where she was, and they only asked the question to alert Avram Avinu to her tznius. So then to send her kosher bracha, they didn't have to ask, where is she? Because they now know. Der Fall sagt Rashi, as das, was haben Marich gewinnt, bei der Schönem gefragt, steche, is bichdei as Avrom, so sie darfen entfern und durch den Mesim Leib sein, als in Oil. So that's what Rashi tells us. They dafka asked the question, which would force Avram Avinu to answer. His answer would be that she's tznius in the oil, which would remind him again of how tznius she is. Was das bringt, because that would highlight the degree of her tznius. Besides that, there's another upside to the explanation which says that they wanted to send a kosher bracha over the explanation which says that they wanted to highlight how tznius she is. He has an additional advantage to explaining that they motivated because they wanted to send her kosher bracha rather than just to say she's tznius. If the entire purpose of their conversation was to say, look how tznius Sarah is, then the objective is not to know where she is. The objective is to know where she's not. Look, she's not here. She's not in our faces. That tells you she's tznius. It wouldn't have been necessary to arrive at the point where Avraham says, no, she is in the tent meaning a fixed article, we know where she is. But if they want to send her a kosher bracha, well then obviously we need a clarity, where exactly is she, so we know where to send this cup. But we still have a question niggling at us. It sounds wholly inappropriate for strange men. We know they're malachim, but their guise is strange men. To be sending a glass of wine to a married woman, why doesn't Avraham Avinu send his own wine? So the fact that the malachim had to send their own cup of wine to Sarah, when Avraham surely could have shared his own cup of wine with her, is for a much more obvious reason than we would have thought. Is moving bepashtus. Seeing as Avraham Avinu is the paragon host, he does the mitzvah of guests better than anybody in history. So therefore, is Avraham given in ganzen Fanum mit Mesham sein die Melochim? You can imagine Avraham Avinu was completely and absolutely preoccupied with serving his guests, these malachim, as the pasuk says. The pasuk says he stood over them and only they ate. He didn't have any food because he was serving. So therefore, he didn't eat. So practically, he didn't have wine to bench on to send the kosher bracha. So who else is supposed to send them the kosher bracha? Can't be Avraham Avinu. He's not eaten. Dermit is euch musber, as das was geschickt Sorgen von sehr kosher bracha is nicht given kenyan von hefech tznius. So now that clarifies that the idea of the malachim sending their wine to Sarah is not immodest. Warum bichdei zizal haben kosher bracha is nicht given ken ander Weg wie schicken von sehr kosher bracha. Because there was no alternative. There was no better option. There was no more modest way to do this. They have the kosher bracha. She needs to get some of the kosher bracha. They have to send it. Or befrat, as nicht sie allein haben das gegeben zu sagen, no haben es geschickt the shager. And of course, they didn't personally encounter Sarah and give her the wine. They sent it. And probably with Avraham himself, or at least as one of his servants. Now, if you're really smart, the 5-year-old student, if he's really sharp, could say 1 second. As Sarah's nemen von seiner kosher bracha is fortni consists b'shleimus. Maybe even the fact that she was willing to accept their kosher bracha, no matter that there was no alternative, maybe that's also not tznius enough. Therefore, Rashi has to tell us who taught us Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina. The Farzak Dashi Om Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina Chulei. Why? What does Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina teach us? Because Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina sagt in Masech the Brachos, Shoisha Makeres bar Chanina Yosef Minoish. Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina says in the Gemara Brachos that women are far, far better at discerning the caliber of their guests than the husbands are. Which means that immediately Sarah would have detected that these guests are not just idolaters passing through, they're not ordinary people. And therefore, So to accept kosher bracha from people who are apparently at such an elevated spiritual level that they even appear perhaps angelic, is not immodest. So we've settled that. So we've settled the whole flow. We've settled all the explanations. We understand now why it's all part of the same conversation about Ayoy, why the Nakudas have to be on the letters that we're going to Darshan because we want to weaken the message, why it's highlighting her tznius, and why they needed to know exactly where she was so that they could send a kosher bracha, which Avram couldn't do and wasn't not tznius because Sarah detected who they were. Felt noch beer, but there's still something that we've left unsolved. We've now shown that all the three explanations do not contradict each other, which is fine. Und der Rebbe came and because they don't all contradict each other. It's fair to say that when the Malachim asked that that they intended all three things. But you cannot escape the fact that there are three independent explanations. Therefore, back to the question we asked earlier, why does Rashi put them all into one long sentence? They should at least have some separators. Unlike how Rashi usually does it when he brings various explanations, even though they're all linked on the same phrase, even if they don't contradict each other, and even where they all complement each other, Rashi still uses words like davar to distinguish between the explanations. Why not here? Is the bir in them's explanation is this? Is the fact that Rashi brings three different explanations in one continuum. Because remember, the whole point over here is that Rashi says at the beginning of the parasha, one malach, one task. That's why there are three malachim standing here in front of Avram and Sarah. And therefore, that means that each angel was asking about Sarah for a different reason. Because Rashi already identified for us at the beginning of the parasha that a single malach cannot do more than one job. And each reason is going to be relevant to one of the three malachim. To send a kosher bracha one malach is good enough. In fact, that's how it is in normal circumstances. When you distribute kosher bracha after benching between everybody, after Avdollah or Kiddush, whatever it is, one person does it. To ask how Avraham Avinu is doing, one malach could have been the representative of everybody else and ask the question. To highlight how modest Sarah is, that Avraham Avinu should pay attention to it, one malach would be sufficient. Last question we have to resolve is, why was it important for Rashi to tell us that the one who teaches us the principle of whether you darshan the letters or the nekudos is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? Why is his shita relevant? Der Bir in dem was Rashi sagt on dem Klal kol makom shaksav Rabbi la nekuda hat gesagt Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Why do we have to know it's him? Because the Klal as wenn die nekuda is Rabbi la ksav at derish nekuda meant. So what do we got? We've got a word. You got 4 letters in the word. 3 of those letters have dots, so we're saying, okay, that means we have to pay special attention to those 3 letters. So what do we intend with that? As we already mentioned earlier, we're not looking here now to cancel or reject the pshat, which is Vayeira, love that they said to Avram Avinu where's Sarah. Certainly Rashi is not going to take an attitude that the nekudos cancel the pshat, because Rashi's entire approach to explaining Torah is pshat. Nor as noisaf zum pirish hapashut. Rather, what we want to illustrate over here is that besides the obvious explanation of the pasuk, wo die oises am nekoda isan achelik von ganzen Wort. If I'm looking at pshat, then I don't see aleph yud vav stand out. I see elav as a word. Besides that, the additional nekudas add an additional perspective, which is that besides the pshat, there's another explanation as well that relates specifically to the words with dots on them. Das heißt, as oich die oisis aminukodos, which means that even those letters that have the dots, Over in the Dan Oisis Aleph Yud Vav, which in our conversation is the three letters Aleph Yud Vav, Zainen dot Svei Inyonim. In those three letters, the two things. Aleph is an Chilek from Vort Elav. First and foremost, Aleph Yud Vav is part of the word Elav, which I read at face value as they spoke to Avraham Avinu. Mit Zadem in Zainen der Oisis Aleph Yud Vav Menukot Beloi Zatofel, weil der Iker from Vort Elav to Avraham is the Lamed. And that's why those are the letters that have the dots, because actually the key hinges on the aleph, which makes the word into Elav. So the main thing we have to know about these letters is that they belong to a word that has a meaning. Then beis avort inem bifnei atzmoi ayoy. Then in addition to that, these three letters also have a secondary message, which is standalone. What's the standalone message? Asking Sarah, ayoy, how's Avraham Avinu doing? So a smart 5-year-old is going to say, does that make any sense? That the smaller portion of the word should influence the larger portion? You're telling me the lamed is going to tell the whole context of what the word really means? How does it make logical sense that I have 3 out of 4 letters that all have to conform in their meaning to a single letter? Why would the minority influence the majority? Rashi resolves that issue by telling us, but look who said this. It was Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. And this principle is the one that will also teach us a take-home lesson. Shimon ben Elazar sagt in Masechta Beitza, in the halachas of Yom Tov, in Masechta Beitza, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar tells us that memalo isha kol hatanur pas b'pnei shapas nefes yavu b'zman shatanur mole. If a woman needs to bake a loaf of bread on Yom Tov, she's permitted to fill the entire oven with loaves of bread, even if she will not use any of the others on Yom Tov, because a full oven helps the bread bake better. Which means, despite the fact that for today, for Yom Tov, she only needs 1 loaf, she's entitled to bake dozens of loaves simultaneously, because the more packed the oven is, you have to remember in those days they had those large ovens, so the more packed the oven is, the better the bread will bake, because there's not a lot of open space in the oven. So what does that tell you? Shimon ben Elazar has a shita that under appropriate circumstances, a whole large amount of something has to surrender itself to a small, or in this case even a single 1 loaf, that now dictates the reality of all these other loaves and how the halacha behaves with regards to them. Using similar logic, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is comfortable with the idea that a single letter lamed will define the other 3 letters Aleph Yud Vav. And that will teach us a lesson. The geschmack, the insight, the depth of Rashi. Very often we'll think in our own lives, wow, the amount of time that I dedicate to Torah mitzvahs is actually very limited. I spend most of my time eating, drinking, doing business, socializing, things which are permitted but not required by Torah. So you could become a little bit depressed by it. When I look at the quantum of space in my life and how much of it is occupied by Torah mitzvahs, there's a big vacuum that is not filled. To that we learn this lesson. As long as what you're doing in the power of time has a direction of serving Hashem, so you earnings that you can afford to chinuch, that you can give tzedakah, that you can make whatever. That all of that quantity of things that we do that is not technically Torah mitzvahs, because it's directed for the purpose of Torah mitzvahs, becomes bottled too and included in the quality of Torah mitzvahs. It's like the woman filling the entire oven for 1 loaf, and all of that other bread takes on the reality of this 1 loaf. Even though on Yom Tov really I'm only supposed to do melacha if it's directly relevant to Yom Tov, Weil der ganze Tanur Pass, wie bald der Kumpich as the Pass shel tzorch Yom Tov so sein nefer yofa. Because the whole reason I've got all this other bread in the oven is to benefit the single loaf that is for Yom Tov. Vet Yom Tov dike Pass, all of that bread becomes Yom Tov bread. And therefore, und der Chol Tanur is angefüllt mit Inyonim, nicht mit Inyonim shechol, sondern mit Inyonim von Yom Tov. So what happens is now the entire oven is no longer filled with a whole lot of mundane bread servicing a single loaf, but all the bread becomes Yom Tov bread. So if I'm engaged with eating or social, exercising, do business, whatever, the focus is that all of that should be able to add value to my Torah and mitzvahs. Or to borrow the expression in Beitza over there, that you're doing all of this to help the bread of your Torah learning bake better, in order to be more successful. As the famous explanation for the Alter Rebbe on the pasuk in the Teicha, which says that when it says that 10 women would bake the bread in a single oven, as the lechem de Torah soll sein eisgebacken in der chamimus tanur ho'ava bo misbenes shelechot. That what it means is that the Torah learning a person does should be fired up with the passion of the tanur, the oven, of echad, of contemplating the oneness of God. Then a person can achieve what the Rambam says in Hilchos Deos, that a person would consistently serve Hashem even when you're doing business, even when you're sleeping. Your sleep is also how you serve Hashem. Sleeping, to be able to have the energy, to be able to focus, to be able to learn, etc. That means that a person becomes an individual who serves Hashem in everything that you do, and in every way that you do things, and even in the lowest parts of those different facets of life. That is the purpose for which the world was created. The whole big world was created for the single loaf. That we should make a home for Hashem, specifically in our limited, finite physical world. As the Rebbe Rashab, whose birthday is Chof Cheshvan, that he explains in detail in Hemshech Samech Vav about the idea of making Dir B'Sachtonim. That will prepare us and take us quickly to the time when we won't need to bake the bread, so to speak. Because as the Gemara tells us, the land of Israel itself will supply all the pastries and all the beautiful clothing, etc. But with the coming of Mashiach, immediately, it's Hashem now.